represents God, and the servants in the story represent us. Now, it was common in Jesus' time for wealthy landowners to travel. And when they did, they would put servants who'd been trained in accounting and money management in charge of their estates when they were gone. And the expectation was that while the master was away, these servants would manage the master's finances and make a profit in the same way that the master would when he was at home. So, before leaving, in verse 15, the master gives 5 talents to one of his servants, 2 to another, and 1 to a third. And a talent equaled 10,000 denarius, and that was a day's wages. So we're talking about huge sums of money. We're talking about 50,000 days' wages, 20,000 days' wages, and 10,000 days' wages. And it's just staggering amounts of money for that time. So the fact that the master entrusts these servants with such large sums of money shows that he has a real confidence, that he has a real trust in them to manage what he's given them. And also it says that the amounts that were given to them were given according to their ability. So the master is thoughtful about what he does. He does not give the servants more than he thinks that each of them can handle. And those are some good thoughts for us. That God has entrusted us with a lot of things in His absence. He's given us the church. He's given us the message of the gospel. And if we, again, believe the words that we say, we believe that God has given us everything that we have. And He calls us to be good stewards of it, to use it wisely, to give a portion back to Him, to use it for His glory. And we also know that He hasn't given us more than we can manage if we rely on Him. One caveat. If we try to go it alone, we'll probably get overwhelmed in this life. Now in verses 16 and 17, it tells us that the servant who had received 5 talents, that he went at once. Important phrase. He went at once, and he put his money to work, and he gained 5 more. And the one who had 2 talents, he did the same thing. He went at once, and he put that money to work, just as the master expected him to do. And that's the key part. They immediately took what they were entrusted with, and they went and did what the master expected. They put it to work. Now, in that time, for a wealthy investor to double their money was not uncommon at all. So a good servant entrusted with this responsibility should have been able to do that by investing or trading and involved in some kind of business. And there's 3 verbs that are used here to describe the action of these 2 servants. And it kind of tells their story. The first is that they went, or literally they went out. The second is that they worked. And the third one is that they gained, or literally that they won. They went, they worked, and they won. They did what they were supposed to. And all of these verbs in Greek, they're aggressive words. They're active words. There is no inertia involved with these first 2 servants. But then with verse 18, we hear about the servant who received 1 talent. And the key thing to recognize here is that, and this is what I think I missed for years and years, and what I think a lot of people miss, the key thing to realize is that he wasn't faithful in doing what the master expected him to do. You see, instead of putting what he'd been entrusted with to work, he went and he buried it in the ground. Now, burying money in the ground was really common back then. It was considered the safest way to protect your money. In fact, it was considered so safe that later rabbinic law would state that if somebody gave you some money to keep for them, if you buried it in the ground, because you had done the safest possible thing, if it was lost or stolen, you weren't responsible. Because you had done due diligence to try and protect that money. And it really looks like this is what the servant was after too. He didn't want any responsibility. He didn't want any work. He didn't want to take any risks. Inertia had set in any number of possible ways. He took his opportunity to serve his master and please his master, and he buried it. And the question for us is, are we doing the same thing in our lives? Are we using the things that God has entrusted to us in the way that God expects us to? And we maybe should think about each of the things that we have in our lives. Am I using this thing? Am I using this talent? Am I using this time? Am I using this money in the way that God expects me to be using it? And it's funny how we make excuses for ourselves. I don't have time, but I sure found a lot of time to watch TV last night. I don't have money, but man, I went to Starbucks about 47 times. We can find ways where we really got to ask ourselves, am I using the things that I have in the way that God expects me to? Now in verse 19, the master returns to settle accounts. And he says, it says in verse 20, the man who had received 5 talents brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 talents. See, I have gained 5 more. And the other servant says the same, and to each of them the master responds happily, saying, good job, faithful servant, and come and share in your master's happiness. So upon hearing the report of these first 2 servants, the master is really happy. He's happy that they have faithfully done what he expected. They took what was entrusted to them and they went and they put it to work. And though it wasn't expected for a slave or a servant who is just doing their job, the master praises them. The master rewards them. That's the kind of guy that he is. And notice that both of them, the one who made 5 talents and the one who made 2 talents, both of them received the same reward. Because it's not about how much they made. It's about the fact that they were faithful to the master in doing what he had expected of them while he was away. And the master tells them that because they've done well with little, they will be given more. And that's how God works. We tend to forget that. But hold on to that for a minute, because we'll come back to it. Now in verses 24 and 5, the servant who has been given 1 talent comes to the master, and he says to him, Master, I knew that you were a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown, and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid, and I went out and I hid your talent in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you. And the real question here is, how should we hear these words? How should we understand them? Are they true? Or is the servant kind of making up a story here? Is he kind of making a false accusation, trying to make an explanation for himself for why he didn't do what he was supposed to do? Oh, I was afraid, so I didn't do it. That's what was going on with me. We have to kind of guess at that. Now, one thing we might look at is the word hard there. He says the master is a hard man. The problem is that word in Greek can mean either strong, which would be flattering and positive, or it can mean harsh, which would be unflattering and not good. So that word doesn't really push our interpretation one way or the other. But if you look at verse 26, you notice that the master calls the servant lazy. That's his assessment of the situation. And the thing that we need to realize is that most of the people in Jesus' time would have agreed wholeheartedly with that assessment. They would have said that this servant didn't do what he was supposed to do, that he didn't show that he cared about the master's property with his actions, and that he should have known better than to do what he did. And we have to also think about the logic of the situation. The wealthy landowner, he didn't give the money to the servant to bury it. If he had wanted it to be buried, he could have done that himself before he left. He gave it to the servant because he expected the servant to go and to put it to work. So after making this strong statement, after calling the servant lazy, then the master begins to kind of turn the servant's words on him. He says, well, if you know how I am, if you know what I do, then shouldn't that have motivated you even more? The servant says, I knew you were a hard man, harvesting where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. And the master's kind of saying, hey, if you knew that, why didn't that motivate you to do even more what I said? Can you really say that you were afraid if you disobeyed my wishes? Can you really say that, or is that just kind of some sort of an excuse? Is kind of the sense that you get there. And notice in verse 26 that the master basically repeats the servant's words back to him, but he leaves out one part, and it's the part about him being a hard man. He leaves that out as though, in my opinion, it's not really even worthy of a response. And then with verse 27, the master kind of calls him out. He says, all right, if you really were afraid, if that's really true, then why didn't you put the money in the bank? Now, putting the money in the bank would have earned just a little interest. It would have been a really small return on the master's money, but it would have been just about as safe as hiding it in the ground. And so the master is kind of saying, look, if you were really afraid, the least you could have done is this. It would have been safe and it would have been very little work for you, but apparently even this was too much for the servant. The servant was either selfish or lazy or afraid to take a risk, but whatever kind of inertia had set into his life that kept him from doing what he should do, the important thing for us to recognize is that God's response to him is basically, that's not good enough. It's not good enough to take what I've entrusted to you and not use it in the way that I expect you to use it. And we've got to reckon with that in our lives. We should each ask, what do I have again? And am I using it in the way that God would have me use it? Am I using it for His glory? Am I being a good